Good evening, everybody, and a really warm welcome to you all this evening. My name is Professor Sarah Barrow. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at UEA. It's my really great pleasure to be introducing Professor Lee Jarvis. Lee's formal pathway to us this evening began a little over 20 years ago, when he made a very late decision to take an A-level in politics, dropping physics and maths in the process. It was clearly the right decision for him, as Lee then continued his studies at the universities of Nottingham and Birmingham, earning his PhD from the latter in 2008. Having spent much of his PhD vowing to leave academia once or if his thesis ever got finished, Lee changed his mind once more and subsequently took up jobs at Oxford Brookes and Swansea University. Lee moved to UEA in 2014 and was awarded his chair in 2017, becoming Professor of International Politics in the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies, or PPL, as we like to know it. Lee's research focuses on how security threats such as terrorism are communicated and the implications of this for citizens, communities and public policy. He's been at the forefront of the emergence of critical terrorism studies in recent years and has published 12 books, 5 special issues, and over 50 articles or chapters, either on his own or in collaboration with others. Lee's co-authored book, Terrorism, A Critical Introduction, won a Choice Outstanding Academic Title award, and his work has been funded by a range of organisations, including the ESRC, the AHRC, NATO, and the US Office for Naval Research. Lee co-edits the academic journal Critical Studies in Terrorism and has founded or directed a number of research networks, including the multinational Cyber Terrorism Project. He's delivered guest lectures on his work around the world and regularly discusses security politics on regional, national, and international media. When he's not doing his research, you're likely to find Lee spending time with his daughters, watching Arsenal, or playing guitar. Tonight, though, is all research and definitely no guitar, which Lee tells me is rather lucky indeed for all of us here. Please join me now, though, in welcoming Professor Lee Jarvis to give his inaugural lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, all of you, for giving up your time to be here with me this evening to come and listen to me talk. 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was sat where you are now, preparing to listen to a colleague of mine giving her own inaugural lecture, and that lecture was, unfortunately for me, fantastic and made preparing for this evening even more terrifying than it already was. While I was waiting for her to begin talking, I was having a chat to my friend, and her husband sat over in the corner of the room there, and my friend and colleague was asking me, have I written my own inaugural lecture yet? I hadn't. But also asking me about the next step for me in my academic career. Now I had become a professor. What do I do next? And you know what? When she asked me that question, I had nothing, absolutely no idea at all what happens from this moment on. I've obviously got research ambitions. I've got half-written books and papers piled up on my desk. I've got case studies I'd like to learn more about. I've got research methods I want to conquer. But in terms of plotting those activities into some kind of coherent pathway taking me into the future, I couldn't answer the question. And that conversation, I think, has kept coming back to me in writing up this lecture. And I think that conversation has kept coming back to me because in writing this lecture, I found it equally difficult to plot out the pathway leading me to here today. I think when we as academics are asked to reflect back on our research careers, there are these temptations to write these triumphant tales of progress that smooth away all of the moments of serendipity and good fortune and so forth that carry us along. There are temptations, I think, to forget the role played by external events in shaping our research careers. Temptations to remember our successes and forget all of the mistakes, failures and wrong turns we make along the way. And of course, temptations to individualise our careers and perhaps to downplay the importance of others. And I wanted to begin by reflecting very briefly on those sorts of dynamics because my own career has most certainly been shaped by them. I've made many, many mistakes and poor decisions along the way. I'm not going to share all of those with you this evening. We don't have time. And external events clearly have helped author my story too. I remember very clearly being stood outside a restaurant in Peru watching the 9/11 attacks take place, and little knowing at the time that I'd be talking about those events 2 or 3 years on as a PhD student, let alone still talking about those events 17 years later here with you this evening. But most of all, I wanted to begin just by really flagging up that my career has obviously and importantly been shaped by other people too. Those include friends, allies, colleagues, mentors within the profession, right? The lecturer I met as an undergraduate student who encouraged me to pursue a PhD before I even knew really what a PhD was. The PhD examiner who passed the thesis, so I'm eternally grateful to him for that, but has since spent so much time providing me with guidance, reference letters, encouragement, and so forth. The heads of department have been good enough to give me a job at various points over the years. And my journey, of course, to this point has been written to by all of those family and friends who have always encouraged, motivated, and stood by me along the way. From my mother, who's somewhere around there, I think, who, as a child, said to me, you can be whatever you want in your life. To my father, who introduced me from a very young age to the importance of political struggle. And of course, my wife and daughters who continue to inspire me and teach me in lots of different ways every day. So, although we often think about academia, perhaps this isn't quite the picture you have in your mind when you think about the professor, I don't know. The green shorts are optional. We think about academia as this very individualistic enterprise, right? As the lone scholar who is sat up there in an ivory tower. And that's definitely not been my experience of the profession. Indeed, it's not really been my experience of writing this lecture today. Most of my research career has been spent working and writing with other people, some of whom are in this room this evening. And I wanted to name and shame all of the different co-authors with whom I've been lucky enough to work, really just to emphasise that in the talk that follows I'll be drawing on lots of collaborative ideas, and that the ideas that I'll be talking about are as much theirs as they are, of course, my own. But also to flag this up because if there is anything inconsistent or vague or wrong or unclear in what follows, maybe we can all blame one of these people and not me. If anyone can come up with a punchline to Madonna, an archbishop, and Margaret Thatcher walking to an inaugural lecture, I'd be so grateful. I've spent so long and I've got nothing. What I wanted to do this evening, though, is to revisit 4 or 5 different research projects on which I've worked that all come together around the themes of terrorism and political violence. And what I wanted to do is to try to pull those projects together in a slightly new way and really to attempt to make a more optimistic argument than I typically find myself making in my written work. The argument's not going to seem very optimistic at all for the first 10 minutes or so you will have to believe me and bear with me. But I wanted to start with 3 examples. December 2014, several songs from an upcoming album by the pop star Madonna were leaked online ahead of that album's release. That leak of those songs Madonna wrote in an Instagram post constituted an act of artistic rape and a form of terrorism. 7 years earlier, in 2007, a prominent archbishop condemned abortion as terrorism with a human face, using the same speech to denounce gay marriage as evil. 20 years before that, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had famously condemned the African National Congress as a typical terrorist organisation. And she did so, of course, 6 years before Nelson Mandela went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, those examples are interesting, I think, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, in different ways, they spotlight the power of the language of terrorism to condemn or to denounce those actions, those people, those groups with whom we disagree. These examples are far from unusual, I think. It's a fairly common rhetorical strategy to demonise or delegitimise one's enemies using this word which has such pejorative connotations. Very few people today describe themselves as terrorists, even though, interestingly, that wasn't always the case. Secondly, these examples are interesting, I think, because they also highlight the contestability of this label, terrorism. All of the actions referred to here could, of course, have been described in quite different ways. Music piracy, the termination of unwanted pregnancies, political resistance, and so forth. There's nothing, in other words, inevitable about the choice of that language in these cases, or I will argue in others as well. And thirdly, if we think about the condemnation of the ANC in particular, we start to get a glimpse already, I think, of the consequences, the quite profound consequences, that can befall individuals or groups to whom this label is applied. Denouncing one's enemies as terrorist offers a very convenient way of refusing to engage politically. Governments frequently tell us we don't negotiate with terrorists, even though we know very frequently they do. So these different examples, I think, encourage us to think about terrorism not as a self-evident thing that exists out there in the world awaiting our discovery or our study, but rather to think about something which is produced or constructed or made. They encourage us to think about terrorism, in other words, as something which is brought into being in the language, the ideas and the practices of people, from pop stars to religious elites to politicians and beyond. So let me clarify what I'm trying to argue here, because this point is sometimes misunderstood. We know, of course, that bombs go off, people get beheaded, aircraft get flown into buildings, but those sorts of actions, and indeed many others, only sometimes get spoken about and thought of as terrorist. The bombing of civilians, for instance, might be thought of as terrorism. At other times it might be referred to quite differently as a military operation. Mass shootings, for instance, are sometimes referred to as acts of terror. At other times, they're depicted in a quite different language of hate crimes. So my point here is that it is the act of labelling something terrorist, be it a bombing or a hijacking or a beheading, that act of labelling those actions terrorist is what transforms the bombing or the hijacking or the beheading into an act of terrorism. In our efforts to make sense of the world around us, we create it. And how we create the world is neither inevitable nor is it neutral. Our language and our ideas involve choices. They involve exclusions, such that understanding violence in one way, perhaps as terrorism, involves refusing or forgetting or failing to understand violence otherwise. Now, my research is interested fundamentally, I think, in the politics of these dynamics. How is it that specific events become widely understood as acts of terror? How is the future threat of terrorism communicated to us? Who benefits from specific acts of labelling? And how do prominent accounts of terrorism impact upon social life, political institutions? And once we start asking those sorts of questions, I think it's fairly tempting to make an argument that there exists today a prominent way of thinking about terrorism, one that we can find across government speeches, newspaper headlines, Hollywood movies, novels, and so forth. And to simplify just a little bit, we might flag up three features of this prominent way of thinking about terror today. In the first instance, the idea of terrorism today typically, I think, refers to a very specific set of violences. Something like violence is conducted by non-state actors against civilians in order to communicate something to a wider audience. The word today is relatively rarely applied to the actions of states, although there are instances of that. It's typically reserved for groups like the Provisional IRA or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram and others. And it's that communicative aspect of terrorism, this idea that terrorism is about sending a message to someone else, which I think is what makes this form of violence seem so distinctive and so reprehensible. The idea that the victims of terrorism have no intrinsic worth, they're merely a means to another end. And we can see, I think, from thinking about that aspect of how the term is typically understood today, where more simplistic or caricatured understandings of terrorists come from as evil or religious zealots, mentally ill and so forth. It seems such a cavalier way of dealing with human life, so far beyond what is normal or what is good. So the second feature of this prominent way of thinking about terrorism today, I think, is that this is a threat which is widely seen to be ubiquitous, a threat that is all around us. Warning alert systems, of course, remind us that we are never entirely free of the threat posed from terrorism, even though that threat might be low at a given moment. Security technologies, preparedness exercises, warning posters encourage us to anticipate and prepare for the next terrorist attack so that we are ready when it inevitably occurs. And we also see this sense of ubiquity, I think, in the perpetual wariness that there exists around terrorism today, the extent to which jokes made on social media, or students reading books on trains, or economics professors working on differential equations in aircraft, or children making spelling mistakes at school, the extent to which those kinds of activities can all be interpreted as suspicious and potentially terroristic. And out of those first two features, we might add, I think, a third, which is that terrorism today is often, I think, seen to be something of an exceptional threat, a threat that is radically different to other forms of harm or violence. And we encounter this sense of exceptionality, I think, firstly, in the more outlandish fears that there are around terrorists using weapons of mass destruction. But we also see this in fairly common suggestions that today's terrorists are very different to their forebears, that today's terrorists are far more brutal even than their earlier counterparts. As R. James Woolsey famously put it in 1994, terrorists today don't want a seat at the negotiating table, they want to blow that table up. So, putting all of this together, and I told you it might not seem very cheery or optimistic to start with, right? We might make an argument that there exists a prominent understanding of terrorism today as a very specific and perhaps an exceptional form of violence that is never very far away. And I think that way of thinking about terrorism is really important because how we think about problems tends to shape our responses to those problems. If we think of terrorism as an exceptional threat, we're already a long way down the road of justifying equally exceptional forms of counter-terrorism response. And you could make a fairly convincing argument, I think, that this is precisely what we've seen in the contemporary period. So, one 2017 report, for instance, from the Watson Institute at Brown University calculated that the costs of the post-9/11 wars had come out at around about 5.6 trillion American dollars. Those wars have, of course, also led to the deaths of enormous, although notoriously difficult to calculate numbers of people. Iraq body count, for instance, currently calculates that there have been 288,000 violent deaths in Iraq alone since the 2003 invasion. Many critics have pointed to the considerable incursions that we've seen in recent years upon civil liberties, human rights and so forth, often through the introduction of new and increasingly expansive legal apparatuses. And, of course, developments in counter-terrorism policy in the recent period have had enormous implications upon social life too. Many communities around countries like the United Kingdom and beyond have reported feeling stigmatised, even threatened by developments within this area. So, as I said, not a very cheery, optimistic start to what I hope will be a slightly more optimistic argument than I typically find myself making, which might be a pretty low bar, I'm afraid. But I wanted to make good, or attempt to make good on that promise now, at least, by highlighting how this prominent understanding of terrorism and the sorts of response that it facilitates, highlighting how these things have also been very widely critiqued. If we look carefully, I think we can find numerous efforts to rethink what terrorism is, to rethink what sort of threat terrorism poses, and numerous efforts to challenge dominant ways of responding to this type of violence. And those sorts of critiques, I want to argue, might tell us something about what can be done for those of us who are unhappy with the ways in which the contemporary politics of terror tends to play out. So, a first and a perhaps potentially surprising source of critique or criticism might be found in the actions of politicians themselves. And a good example here comes out of some work I've been doing with Tim Legrand, looking at efforts within the United Kingdom and beyond to ban or prescribe terrorist organisations. So in the United Kingdom today, there are 74 different international organisations that are currently banned. It's illegal to be a member of any of the groups on this list or to support them in various ways, attending a meeting or wearing uniforms associated with those groups. All of those kinds of activities are criminal offences. And this power, prescription or banning, attracts periodic media publicity. It was the one that was used in the conviction of Anjem Choudhury in 2016 for his inviting support for ISIS. And it was also the power that was used a week or so ago, I don't know if you'll remember, against a couple who were members of the far-right banned group National Action, and this couple got some kind of media notoriety at the time because they'd named their son after Adolf Hitler. Now, Why this is interesting and important to me is that when the government makes a decision to add new organisations to its list of banned groups, which is something it does periodically, Parliament has to come together and debate that decision. And those debates are really, really interesting, I think, for a number of reasons. They tell us a little bit about how professional politicians think about the national identity and the British political process. But they're also interesting here because those debates are regularly used by politicians as an opportunity to depart from and arguably to critique this very established and prominent way of thinking about terrorism that I've been sketching so far. There are lots of examples in these debates, to put it slightly another way, in which what terrorism is or how we should respond to terrorism are called into question. So here are a couple of examples of the kinds of thing that I'm thinking about. We see concerns being articulated in these debates about the political dimensions of the language of terrorism. Who gets to decide what groups are banned in what countries at what time? We get fears too, Jeremy Corbyn in 2011, around the effectiveness of counter-terrorism policy, a concern he expresses here that countering terrorism might be better done through political dialogue or negotiation than through banning particular organisations. We get concerns too that efforts to counter terrorism might be thought of as disproportionate, that it might be that the banning of particular organisations is unjust, and concerns as well about the distinctiveness, the exceptionality of terrorism and the risk that this label obscures quite important political realities, such that other organisations or other groups might be responsible for more violence than those we think of as terrorist. So my point here is that even in the heart of the British political system, if you like, where we might expect this prominent way of thinking about terrorism to be at its most coherent, we find important examples of criticism emerging. And a related example, but much more implicit there, is something we find when we look simply at the ways in which politicians talk about things like security threats. So this is an example that came from my PhD, where I started my academic career, and I was thinking there about the ways in which the George W. Bush administration was thinking about and referring to time in describing the war on terror. And one of the things that became very clear to me quite quickly is that that administration spoke about and thought about time in very, very different ways. So we've got three examples here of people thinking about the 9/11 attacks and situating those attacks historically. In the first example, 9/11 is positioned or thought about as something utterly unique, something unprecedented, a really radical break with the past. In the second example, 9/11 is sort of new, again, but only as a kind of ramping up of previous types of terrorism, as a quantitative increase in things we'd seen before. And in the third example, we see 9/11 being presented as not very new at all, as little more than a reincarnation of the sorts of things we saw in the mid-20th century from fascists, totalitarians, and others. And those differences, those tensions or those contradictions between these very different ways of talking about and thinking about the same event from the same people at roughly the same time might, I think, give us a way into unpicking or deconstructing prominent understandings of and ways of thinking about terrorism. They might encourage us to think that the meaning of 9/11, as an example, is far less clear or coherent or settled than we might otherwise assume. Now, if we're interested in critiquing prominent ways of thinking about terrorist violences, it makes sense, I think, in some ways, to begin by looking at politicians. These are people that have a responsibility for countering this threat, and in some ways their understandings of the world carry significant weight. But I think there are dangers to stopping our analysis there as well, because doing so would only offer a very partial picture of all of the different ways in which terrorism is thought about, spoken about by all sorts of social actors, politicians, pop stars, and indeed ordinary people, citizens. And in some of the work that I've been doing with Michael Lister, we've been trying to think about how ordinary people, for want of a better phrase, people like us, how do ordinary people think about things like terrorism and counter-terrorism? And speaking to citizens about these kind of topics, we've argued, provides an important way of engaging with the richness of public opinion in this area, and encourages us to think about public understandings or public opinion as much less predictable and much less inevitable than we might think. So I've got some examples here from a series of focus groups that we ran on that project, where we asked different communities within the United Kingdom to discuss their experiences and their understandings of counter-terrorism policy in the United Kingdom today. And that research, I think, helped to bring forward a number of quite important public anxieties around developments in this area. So we found lots of evidence of citizens feeling concerned that contemporary counter-terrorism policy had led to the curtailing of important rights, diminishing things like freedom of speech, freedoms of association, and so forth. Lots of concerns that counter-terrorism policy in the contemporary period had made it more difficult to engage politically, encouraging people to self-censor, to withdraw from protests, political debates, and so forth. Concerns, too, that the politics of counter-terrorism today has made it more difficult for people to identify as British, making particular groups of people, particular communities, feel suffocated or alienated. And finally, concerns that came out of these focus groups around the extent to which developments in this policy arena had served to diminish the sense of duty that citizens within the United Kingdom today feel towards the state. And those arguments, or arguments like these, I think, are really important because, again, they serve as additional examples of political critique. We've got very specific arguments going on here around the ways in which British citizenship is being or has been eroded by contemporary counter-terrorism practices. And while speaking with publics in this kind of way is important because I think it can help enrich our understanding of public apprehensions or concerns, speaking to publics about these topics can also be important, I think, in helping to create or produce new forms of critique. This kind of work can provide members of the public with opportunities, if you like, to speak truth to power. So there are a couple of examples here. The first is from the project I was just referring to, where we have somebody who'd taken part in one of our focus groups making a very explicit challenge to government. What are you going to do now? I've told you all of the concerns that I have about how you're going about policing terrorism and so forth. The second example is from a more recent project on which I've been working with Lee Marsden and Ailem Atikev. And what we can see here, I think the project was set up around this theme of British Muslim values, and we worked with different members of Muslim communities in the region, some of whom I've seen over here. Hi. And we can see here the extent to which participating in this project provided an opportunity for one of the participants to foreground lives or experiences or values that get too often marginalised within media or political debates. So, alongside political language and everyday life, if you like, the final example I wanted to give you of the ways in which prominent ways of thinking about terrorism and counter-terrorism are being or have been critiqued is, to put it broadly, I guess, within the realm of popular culture. And I'm thinking here about a range of different activities. Satirical interventions, so films like Four Lions or jokes or street art, political cartoons and so forth, that invite us to laugh at terrorists rather than fear them, that encourage us to ridicule, to see ineptitude rather than threat. I'm thinking also about things like video games, on which I've been working with Nick Robinson recently. And again, these are a really important and interesting side of popular culture because although many video games in this area tend to reproduce this sense of terrorism's exceptionality, encouraging us to go out there and shoot as many bad guys as possible, there are other examples of games which encourage us to do very different things, that encourage us to question militarism by forcing their players to engage with issues around post-traumatic stress disorder, or games that deliberately slow down the pace of play at very particular moments to encourage more contemplative engagements with political violence. And we also, I think, interestingly, see challenges to this dominant way of thinking about terror in what we might call memory projects of various sorts. So newspaper obituaries of those we would call terrorists, like Osama bin Laden and others, quite often, I think, take us some way beyond very simplistic condemnations and caricatures of those sorts of people. They situate those people within family contexts, private lives and so forth. They contextualise political violences within broader geopolitical dynamics and structural contexts. And they encourage us to think about terrorists as something much more than bogeymen, as something much more than simply evil or religious fanatics. And we can see something similar, I think, in much more informal sites of memory too. So these are examples from an online archive called Where Were You, which was set up in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks as an opportunity for members of the public to record exactly what they were doing when they heard about those events. And what's interesting looking through that archive is that there are lots of examples of people basically reproducing what the politicians at the time were saying, people reflecting what the Bush administration was saying about the attacks. But there are other examples too of people doing quite different things, of people critiquing the immediate post-9/11 response, either through articulating quite profoundly cosmopolitan visions of the sanctity of human life, irrespective of national borders, or through reworking or rewriting national identity in much more precarious ways than we tend to encounter when we think around national security issues. So, I guess the argument that I've been trying to make is that prominent understandings of terrorism as a particular ubiquitous and perhaps exceptional threat, meriting similarly exceptional forms of counter-terrorist response, are actually far more contested and challenged than we might instinctively think. And that this is an understanding of terrorism, I think, which comes under scrutiny in a whole range of places. Satirical films, street art, video games, memorial websites, newspaper obituaries, public experiences, and even the language of politicians. And to finish, what I'd really like to try to do is to zoom in on some of the differences between those types of critical intervention and to really think about this question, what is to be done for those of us who might be sceptical or suspicious or unhappy about the ways in which the politics of terror tends to play out today. Michael Lister, who's in the room somewhere, said to me before I gave my first ever academic presentation, never ever have a table because this is all anyone will focus on. And I'm going to finish on a really complicated table, but bear with me. A first thing that I think we can do when we encounter assertions about terrorism and counter-terrorism is to simply reject them, to challenge their fundamental assumptions as incorrect. And we see something like that, I think, in newspaper obituaries, right? That bin Laden isn't simply evil, he's a man situated within historical circumstances. We see this kind of rejection or repudiation also taking place, I think, in debates around state terrorism, which set out to question or to challenge or to dismiss the artificial limiting of this term terrorism to the actions of non-state actors. And this sort of strategy for critique, repudiation or rejection is tempting and seductive, I think. But there's a risk, of course, that it encourages us to simply trade one form of truth about terrorism for another. Why would the alternative stories we want to tell about bin Laden or state terrorism be any less vulnerable to the questioning or the subversion than the stories with which we're attempting to replace? A second thing we might try to do is to ask the sorts of questions that we see in places like parliamentary debate. Why do you think Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group? Why are you doing X, Y, Z to counter this threat and so forth? And that sort of critical strategy of asking questions, I think, seems potentially quite useful as a way of eliciting justifications from political elites, getting politicians and others to explain themselves, if you like. But critiques that are based upon asking questions of those perhaps in power also risk doing so on a terrain that has already been established. What we ask about and how we ask those questions is likely to be guided by a set of rules or conventions that have already been laid out for us. That's certainly true, I think, in parliamentary debate, but it's also true in other places too. Thirdly, more creative, we get efforts to critique terrorism through acts of subversion via street art, film and so forth. Efforts which work to contest dominant ways of thinking about terrorism through ridicule and the like. These kinds of strategies, I think, are very creative, but the risk is that they are vulnerable to marginalisation because their aesthetic impact might be more immediately visible, perhaps, than their political impact. We might, put more simply, watch a film like Four Lions, laugh, and then go away having forgotten about it. The fourth thing we might do is to try to bring forward marginalised voices, marginalised stories. Or indeed we might work to try to create those sorts of stories and experiences by speaking with real people in real communities. Michel Foucault, the theorist, talks about this in terms of reactivating or emancipating subjugated knowledges. And this is a sort of critical strategy that I find particularly attractive in some ways. But again, there are dangers in trying to critique dominant ways of thinking about terrorism like that, because there are ethical questions involved in trying to speak on behalf of the marginalised, the unqualified, the dispossessed. And then the final thing we might do if we're unhappy with how the politics of terror plays out is not to attempt to replace or even broaden conventional understandings of terrorism, but instead to try to analyse how those understandings have been put together, to pull attention to prominent ways of thinking about and talking about terrorism, and to think about the assumptions and the histories and so forth upon which those dominant understandings depend. So we've seen, for instance, that events like 9/11 don't simply speak for themselves. They're given meaning in the way that we frame them. And by taking those frames seriously, perhaps we're in a position to begin exposing their contradictions, their histories, their consequences. Now, such an approach needs, I think, to navigate accusations of triviality and conservatism. Doing this might have less value in terms of providing a very clear alternative way of thinking about terror or counter-terror. It might be seen as purely or entirely critical without having anything to put in its place. But disturbing rather than extending or replacing dominant ways of thinking about terror might be a productive way of making what seems to be inevitable or objective or self-evident appear less so. Now, my guess ultimately is that each of these strategies, and others too, have a place for those of us who believe prominent ways of thinking about encountering terrorist violence are problematic. And the success of any of these sorts of critical activity, I think, are likely to be context-specific and dependent upon a whole range of factors, including public resonance and the capacities of the critic. Their success is also probably only likely to be known in hindsight. But what I hope, however, is that thinking about these kinds of ways of engaging with the politics of terror provides us at least with some room for optimism and perhaps some pointers for what to do going forward. Thank you very much for your time.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Lee Marsden. I'm the head of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies. And for these inaugural events, that we have a vote of thanks to the speaker. And it's my privilege to be able to give a vote of thanks to Professor Lee Jarvis this evening. I've known Lee. He may not have remembered me, but I remember him from 11 years ago. When I started out my academic career, it was at the first full-time job I got was at Oxford Brookes University. And within a year of getting that post, I was lucky enough to get a job here at UEA. And there was a lot of fuss being made about who would succeed me in that position. Somebody who's clearly much better and much more gifted than the incumbent. And so there's great deal of excitement about this young PhD student from Birmingham University, who'd already published a number of pieces, and was going to transform the department, and it was going to be great and wonderful. And I heard Lee speak at that particular thing, and he, lo and behold, did actually follow me at that particular university. Stayed a short time, but I followed Lee's career for a number of years. And when the opportunity came for him to apply here, it was one of the things which was right at the top of my sort of list of priorities to try and get him here and to make sure that he was employed here. And I think you can understand why when you've heard this tour de force this evening. Lee is just so versatile in terms of his approach to academia. Not only very gifted in terms of understanding terrorism and counter-terrorism, but also a tremendous colleague, extremely gracious, very collaborative as well. And one of the things which I hope we do get out of this evening, and my particular thanks to him this evening, is that his work is one that challenges dominant narratives. The principle being basically that if you have the same thinking, you end up with the same results. And in terms of terrorism and counter-terrorism, some of these set sort of patterns and ways of thinking really do need to be disrupted and challenged, and there's nobody better in the United Kingdom at being able to do that than Lee Jarvis. He's kindly agreed, well, he doesn't know that he's agreed, but he has agreed to take questions for about 10 minutes or so before we can actually get on to some wine and to have a chat with him and to celebrate. Do you want to field your own questions, Lee, or...?
Are you happy to do that?
Yes, yeah, I'm happy to do that.
I don't need to play favouritism.
No, that's fine. Okay, so we probably two or three questions, I imagine.
Yeah.
There. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Do you think the fight against terrorism would be helped if the army and the police found a way of incapacitating a terrorist without actually killing? Could they do more research that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in very broad terms, I'm sceptical about the value of violence to prevent future forms of violence, right? That I think it's important to have some kind of congruity between means and ends, right? That if you want non-violent outcomes, violence might not be the best way of doing it. So I'm not an expert on the police or the military, but certainly in terms of the underpinning gist of your question, if I've understood it correctly, this sense that maybe incapacitating and executing would-be terrorists might not be the best way of doing that. I certainly agree. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, lovely.
Do you feel that not just the British but other national governments have a fetishisation over Islamic terrorism and de-emphasise, say, the increase in far-right terrorist activity, or do you feel that counter-terrorism strategy is more broadly focused?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think it's, if you'd have asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago, I think it would have been a pretty straightforward yes, right? That I think, so if you look, for example, at the list of banned organisations within the United Kingdom, but also beyond, I think, these are so overwhelmingly dominated by groups we might call Islamist. Right? They're massively overrepresented within that kind of list. And until very recently, I think there's been this real emphasis on those kinds of violence and those kind of groups. If you were going to be sympathetic, you might say, well, that's understandable. This is where the threat that we're encountering is coming from at the moment. But I think things are beginning to change. And if you look at developments within counter-terrorist strategies, there is certainly far more emphasis being placed today on far-right groups, for instance, and fears that what we might call lone actor terrorists that are inspired by right-wing ideas are becoming more prominent. So I think it is beginning to change.
The lady there, and I'll come to you, sir.
Taking like events that we've had in America and sort of domestic actors, why do you think there was such a drama to be labelling international actors as terrorists, whereas domestic actors are very much seen as more just extreme or hold more extreme views, but never actually labelled as sort of terrorists?
Yeah, it's a really good question. A broadly post-colonial response would be, well, these things are kind of raced, right? That the sorts of organisation and groups that we talk about as terrorists are groups that we see as other to ourselves. They don't look like us, they don't sound like us. By ourselves, I mean the people that are, by and large, represented in these policy communities. So you could make that sort of argument. The problem, I think, is that distinctions between terrorism and other forms of violence break down very quickly when you try to set them in stone. That if terrorism is understood as the use of political violence against civilians, really crudely, for instance, all of those components, political, violence, civilians, are fundamentally contestable. There's no agreement or no consensus on what any of those things are. So the politics of those labellings are important. Yeah, thank you.
From what group does the greatest threat to our security come from? How will it be manifested? And what countermeasures can be taken? It's a huge question, which you've probably answered already, but maybe it went above my head. So those are sort of 3 parts to the one question.
Yeah, and I'm going to do something really annoying, I think, for you, which is to say that's the wrong question that we should be asking.
That is annoying.
I know. And I'll tell you, but let me explain that. Because those are the kinds of questions that terrorism studies, for example, as an academic discipline, has really been mobilised around this question, firstly, of definition, what is terrorism? Secondly, this question of causality, what causes terrorism? And thirdly, this question of response, what do we do? And my perspective would be, actually, there's something else we could do, which is to ask how it is that particular groups get thought of as terrorists at particular times, or how it is that the risk or the insecurity driven by particular groups is prioritised at particular moments. So my sense would be that in a way there's as much to be gained politically by watching the watchers as attempting to get at the kinds of things that they're watching. Partly that's a political stance, right? Partly that's what I think, that comes back to my understanding of what academia should be about. And in my view, academia should be fundamentally about critique. But it's also partly, I guess, pragmatic in that it's very difficult to get accurate or reliable knowledge around the kinds of question that you're asking unless you're a member of the intelligence community. So I can sort of see that might be a really frustrating answer, but I hope it explains it a little bit.
Okay, we're going to take the final question, which will be...
I don't know if you're aware of Christopher Davidson's book, Shadow Wars. He's a lecturer in the University of Sheffield, I think. But he shows how ISIS was like a strategic asset for many of UK's formal allies. And I just wondered, I was quite impressed that an academic come out and write this kind of book. I just wondered if you have found or you feel there's any glass ceilings to just how far you can criticise the current narrative, if there's places you feel you can't go.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'll know when I get there, right? The very, very first international conference I ever did as a PhD student, and I was nervous and worried, I didn't know how it would go and all that kind of thing. I gave my paper, sat down, and you usually have a table of 3 speakers, and I looked at the presenter who was sat next to me, who was from a very different kind of background, a different type of establishment, and he'd written down, I remember this so clearly, yes, but whose side are you on? And that kind of logic and that kind of sense of certainty I find really difficult and really dangerous too. So my sense would be that we have there is a really important responsibility to do things like try to speak truth to power, to pull apart what we are told around issues particularly as important as things like terrorism, and to keep doing that because I think criticism and critique is something which is always precarious and temporary and provisional, right? This is something that never finishes. There are always new questions to ask and ways to think. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lee. We're going to... Oh, go on. I'll sneak you in. Go on. One more. Sorry, we're working overtime now.
Thank you for the insights that you have given. And I think it's a great thing, breaking the prevalent established narratives that become sort of common sense in our societies. So the question is, you talk about Foucault's discourse. Do you think that the discourse is going to die of natural organic death, or do we need to do some conscious efforts in order to disrupt the discourse on terrorism?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? And that's an important question. My sense would be that I would think about critique, for instance, in the same way that I might think about something like resistance as something that can be explicit and active and determined, but also as something which happens, that whenever things seem stable or set in stone or uncontroversial or uncontestable, actually they tend to sort of start falling apart as well. And I guess what matters then is where we situate ourselves politically and ethically, what we think our role is in terms of stimulating those sorts of fallings apart, if you like. So I've tried to be as optimistic as I can. I don't think we're on the verge of a particularly revolutionary new way of thinking about terrorist violence, but I think there are green shoots out there, that I think there are critical voices and challenges that are important as well. Thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please could you express your appreciation for Professor Lee Jarvis.